My name is Jeffrey Katz, and I'm the president of the Washington Map Society. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to this evening's program, which features Frank Manasek, who many of you may already know as the author of a leading guide to map collecting, and some, including myself, also may be familiar with his engaging novels grounded in the map collecting world. Tonight's program is the latest in our monthly program, sponsored virtually by a partnership of 7 map societies representing all parts of the country. I can name them: the California, Chicago, New York, Philip Lee Phillips, Rocky Mountain, Texas, and the Washington Map Society. All of these map societies are nonprofit organizations that support map collecting, cartography, and the study of cartographic history, and are financial sponsors of this Zoom meeting. And if you're not a member of at least one of these societies, we hope you'll consider joining at least one of them. The benefits vary for each society, and here's my plug. Members of the Washington Map Society receive 3 annual issues of the Portolan Journal, digital access to all past issues of the Portolan, digital access to past guest speaker lectures, and many other features in the members only section of the WMS website. And if you're not a member, we have an introductory rate of $25 for the first year of a digital membership. We and our partner map societies would also like to thank our advertisers who support our groups and also help make possible the publication of our journals, the Portolan and Calafia, the Journal of the California Map Society. So before we proceed further with tonight's program, underscore the usual housekeeping matters. Please note that this lecture is being recorded. So please turn off your video and microphone if you do not want to be recorded. Also, please use the chat feature to type questions, and they will be addressed at the conclusion of the talk. And with that, I'd like to turn the program over to Ron Grimm, the WMS Vice President and Program Chair. Ron?
Hey, thank you, Jeff. In consultation with some of the other map societies, we have been developing a program for the rest of the winter and the spring. We're just about ready to finalize that program list, which will appear in the next issue of the Portolan, and I will be sharing it with the other map societies. Now, I'd like to, at this time, bring your attention to the next meeting, which will be on January 5th on a Thursday. And our speaker will be Andrew Capuchunas, who is the secretary of the New York Map Society. He's also a member of the Lithuanian Cartographic Society, and he's a retired data and processing consultant. The title of his talk is "The Struggle of Mapmakers to Keep Up with the Changing Post-World War I Boundaries Between Lithuania and Poland." In that talk, he will examine how maps and atlases publishers struggled, and I think that's probably going to be a strong word in his talk, to depict European boundaries after World War I, especially in the area of Poland and Lithuania. And now it is my pleasure I'm sorry, I'm having, I think you can all see the screen. I have a new laptop. I'm not pushing all the buttons right yet. Our speaker tonight is Frank Manasek. He's a retired professor at Dartmouth Medical School. He's a former antiquarian map dealer, and he is the author of 2 map-related books, one collecting old maps, and more recently, a treatise on moon maps. The title of his talk tonight is "The Birth of Moon Maps, Looking Through the Telescope." And in this presentation, he will focus on about 15 moon maps that were published between 1610 and 1696, shortly after the invention of the telescope. So before I turn the program over to Frank. Just if you have questions, type them in the chat feature, and I will help read, and he will address the questions at the end of his presentation. And now turn it over to Frank.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that nice introduction. I'm going to give this a try. Now, does that work?
Looks good, Frank. Very good.
Oh,
Good.
okay, fantastic. This evening, I'm going to illustrate some of the problems encountered when an instrument of natural philosophy, the telescope, revealed a truly new world that permits us, and this punctate beginning in 1610 permits us to witness the development of a mapping of a discretely defined period of time of an entirely new world. And we can follow the development, the evolution, the early development of a subset of cartography. Now, we're all familiar with this. It's my favorite old map, actually, and it's a new world only because it was new to the Europeans. Everything could be, that's shown on this map, could be named, described by both European and the local inhabitants. The languages were quite adequate for everything seen on this map. And indeed, the historian Anthony Pagden noted that Jose de Acosta, who was one of the Jesuits in the New World between around 1500 and 1530 or so, noted that if something was entirely new, we couldn't describe it. But images of the moon have been known for quite a while. Jan van Eyck in the 1420s painted the moon, great precision in both one of the panels of the Ghent altarpiece and also in his crucifixion. And what he showed were these areas. These are the old spots. These are the things that when you look up at the moon, you see the man in the moon or the rabbit in the moon or the old lady with the faggots on her shoulder, depending upon your dominant culture. But these are the old spots, and they are shown here light, but they are dark, and they are dark because they have low reflectivity. We now know them to be lava flows, and they are known as the seas or the Maria. And we also need to remember that in the 17th century, geology was in its pre-infancy. And all we need to do is to look at Athanasius Kircher's illustrations in his Mundus Subterraneus to get a good idea of how geology and geologic processes were perceived in this time. The age of the world was based on historical chronology. We had air, earth, fire, and water. Vacuum was still disputed despite Robert Boyle and Torricelli. And there were many attempts to correlate or to understand what we see on the moon with terrestrial, known terrestrial formations. This never really quite worked because there isn't good correlation. Indeed, very little seen on the moon has any representation here on Earth. It was not really quite appreciated until the 19th century when Phillips did his work. But it's interesting to note that the historian of visual solar system observation, William Sheehan, noted that perception is a process of probabilistic knowledge-driven inference. That's sort of a mouthful, but but it says everything, and it will help us put into perspective the images that I'm going to show as we go along. And we're all familiar with the 17th century terrestrial maps, and let's keep those in mind as we look at the lunar images. But lunar images are all through the telescope, which makes them unique. Terrestrial cartography was not done with the intervention of a philosophical instrument, the telescope. Moon mapping began as making scientific drawings through this instrument. So we need to know a little bit about it. Now, the Galilean telescope and all the telescopes of the 1600s, the 17th century, were refracting. They had an objective lens here. Light came through and was focused to the eyepiece where it was observed by the observer. The position of the image in the eyepiece and as drawn in lunar maps is totally a function of what telescope was used. On the Galilean telescope, images are upright. With the astronomical or Keplerian telescope, they're inverted or actually rotated. And when we look at the moon with our naked eye, the top part, we call that north. North is upwards in a Galilean telescope, and it's down at the bottom, and south is at the top in an astronomical telescope. This has no real meaning. It's not an anomaly like the Munster inverted Europe. It's or the east on top, Blau Nova Belgica. It doesn't matter because in space there's no north, south, up or down. And when Galileo, who was an artist, really, he was well versed in Renaissance concepts of perspective, shadow, chiaroscuro. Look at the moon. He described very clearly the irregular terminator. The terminator differentiates the illuminated portion of the moon from that which is not. There's no atmosphere on the moon, so the terminator is absolutely abrupt. We have no twilight. And if we look at this region slightly enlarged, we see that Galileo noted that these structures, these spots, now these are the new spots. They are new because they were revealed by the telescope, have shadows in them. And since the sunlight is coming from this direction, he concluded properly that they are concave. We now call them craters. They were not called craters then, they were simply called spots. These are the old spots that we saw in the visual diagram of the moon. And these are the new spots. And for a very long time, everything on the moon was spots. There were light spots, dark spots, big spots, little spots. Bob Garfinkel noted a very early reference to the term crater. That did not gain traction until the 1790s, when Schroeder introduced the term, and thereafter we refer to these as craters. Historically, it's inappropriate to call these images of Galileo's, these are etchings that Galileo had commissioned to call these craters, but let's use that term because we all know what it means. Now, we only see things on the moon by dint of their shadow. We cannot see them directly by looking at them. So this creates a very interesting problem. With the sun directly overhead, if we have a peak here, we don't see it because it doesn't throw a shadow. If this material of the peak is the same reflectivity as the surrounding terrain, we don't see it. If the material is lighter, it appears as a light spot. If it's darker, it appears as a dark spot. However, if the peak is over here and we have oblique sunlight coming this way, this peak throws a shadow and therefore it becomes visible. We're not seeing the peak, we're seeing its shadow, and we interpret all of the shadows along the terminator by means we interpret the structures all along the terminator by means of the shadows they throw. Now, as the sun rises higher over the lunar terrain, this shadow becomes attenuated, and this little peak that was in shadow and invisible before now throws its own and becomes visible. So when we look at the moon, we can't see all of the terrain at the same time. In essence, as the sun climbs over the lunar surface, it unzips the shadows along the terminator. And it's only along the terminator that we can see lunar surface. So this is an important thing that we'll see later on. Now, following Galileo's realistic presentation of what he saw, there are only 4 woodblock maps produced. They followed immediately after Galileo's etchings. They are not naturalistic drawings. They represent an anachronistic abstraction, pre-Renaissance view of drawing from nature. And we'll see that there's a vast different perception of the surface. This is the first of these maps. And these are really rather small maps. These are 9 or so centimeters in diameter. This is a woodblock map by Christoph Scheiner. And he ignores the direction of sunlight. This is not a realistic drawing. It's not realism. It's not drawing from nature. It is really an abstraction. And it's planimetric. Galileo's was topographic. It was pictographic, if you will. And let's look at this region in somewhat greater magnification. Whereas Galileo showed what we call craters here with the shadows demonstrating their concavity, Scheiner really didn't interpret shadows. He was at a loss as to how to do that. And so instead, we see these sort of random lines of hash marks. The terminator, the irregular terminator, is clearly defined as a discrete line. These are the old spots, somewhat distorted, but Scheiner also was unable to give any indication of elevation. So this is very difficult to interpret. We don't know what these hash marks mean, whether he's implying that this old spot is elevated or what. So we have a very different visual language than Galileo's. The last of the 4 woodblocks that I'm going to show, published in 1631. And we see the same thing here, the terminator, rather clearly defined. But notice here the craters are all little circles. Some are large and some are small. The old spots are shown sort of schematically, but there is no foreshortening. This is a very planar view. The sun, of course, is coming from this direction. And it's clear that this sort of scattering of craters doesn't represent the location of each crater. It's simply saying there's a whole lot of these things here. And there's no information about them. We can't tell very much about them. And one of the problems is that seeing something for the first time is really difficult. So let's take a break from that and sneak ahead 100 years. And I'll show you this crater drawn by James Naismith. Crater walls have terracing on the inside and on the outside, and many of them have central peaks. One of the things that's very obvious when you look at the moon with even 5 powers is the rays system. Now, the rays emanate largely from 2 craters. This is Tycho and this is Copernicus. Kepler is out here, and there's some rays coming out of these. 2 weeks ago, I looked at the just post-full waning moon with 8-power binoculars, and the ray system was absolutely striking. You look at the moon and the first thing you see are the dark spots, and then you notice the rays cascading across the surface. Galileo did not draw them. They don't appear on the etchings he commissioned, and they don't appear in any of his wash drawings, which is quite remarkable because the magnifications used at this time ranged between 8 and a maximum of about 40 times magnification. And the ray system is very, very obvious, and Galileo didn't show it despite being an artist and somebody who was capable of drawing from nature. The rays were first drawn on what we may call a map or a drawing from nature by Fontana. In this case, south is at the top. Fontana used an inverting telescope that really, again, doesn't matter except for if you're trying to compare it to another image. And this is probably the first map to show the ray system. Fontana referred to this as the greater fountain, and this is the lesser fountain, because he compared these to emanations from fountains, fountains spurting things. He also showed that craters aren't simple little circles or ovals. There's great pleomorphism. And if you look at his craters, they're all different shapes. You recognize that. There's some that are sort of round, but many are oval, and some are quite distorted. He also was the first to put central peaks in his craters. He noticed the existence of central peaks. Now, Fontana tried very hard to describe what he saw. And going back to the problem of describing something that you've never seen before, finding words, as opposed to simply giving them names. A nomenclature is not really a taxonomy, but we can see that he used some rather curious ways of describing what he saw. This came back to haunt his reputation later, and he was mocked for calling them diamonds and pearls. But he had to use analogy to describe what he thought he saw. Unfortunately for Fontana, he published, well, these early 1629, 1631 images, engravings were published and disseminated throughout Europe. Every single astronomer in Europe had copies of this and saw what Fontana was doing. The book was not published until 1646, and his later illustrations aren't any better than this. He was not a good draftsman. Nonetheless, he described the rays, he described crater pleomorphism and discovered the central peaks, and tried very hard to create a system of descriptors. He failed at that despite being a lawyer. He was not sufficiently loquacious, but we come to an artist, Claude Milan, who was engaged to make engravings of the moon. Milan was a very famous portraitist. He worked with, he was an engraver, and he really perfected the ability to create a three-dimensionality by simply thickening and thinning the engraved line. He used illusion, almost visual deception. He never drew anything. We don't see the eye drawn. We don't see the eyebrow drawn. It is all implied. Now, this is one of his very famous portraits, and it's a single spiral of an unbroken engraved line varying only in thickness to give this three-dimensionality. And it's very successful in portraits. It creates a lifelike image. And everyone can, just by looking at this, can tell that this is the right eye of Jesus. But when he applied this same technique to the moon, we got a very good portrait of the moon. This is about what one would see if one took a photograph of the moon through, I don't know, a 90 or 120 millimeter telephoto lens. It's quite well positioned. The proportions are correct. The terminator is very nicely delineated. And if the light is coming from this direction, and if we look at this area at higher magnification, and here the light's coming from this direction, we see, much like Galileo did, a realistic pictorial presentation of what is seen through the telescope. He doesn't really draw the craters, doesn't give crater detail rim, he implies it. And he implies craters here, for example, simply by thickening and thinning his engraved line. Now, if you look closely, you do see thin lines outlining these structures here. Those are probably etched. And these images were all made the same way terrestrial maps were. The great outlines were generally etched, and then the engraver went and filled in the details. So this is very lifelike. But we see no central peaks. Milan was certainly aware of them. In order to see this amount of detail, he had to have seen central peaks. And he was also aware of Fontana's work. When he did an engraving of the entire full moon, where the sun is directly overhead, like right here, we see nice orthographic projection. Everything is in approximately the right position. But is this a map of the moon? Well, it isn't. What it is it's a map of reflectivity, or albedo. Astronomers refer to the reflectivity of something as its albedo. And we see old spots, they're dark. These are the things we see as the man and the moon. We don't see new spots because they're not throwing shadows. We don't, and if we enlarge this area down here, but we do see, by the way, we do see rays because the sun is nice and high, and we do see the lunar rays. But let's enlarge this area, look over here, and again, we notice that Milan is using horizontal, parallel lines of different thickness to build up the impression of an image. But we can't see craters because they don't, with the sun directly overhead, there's no shadow. And he has delineated them here for our benefit. But this is, if we want to call this a moon map, fine, but it's really a map of the surface properties, the optical, the reflective properties of the material on the moon. It's not a map of lunar structures. Van Langren, this is generally called the first moon map, and Van Langren made this map with the intention that it be used as a celestial timepiece for determining longitude. And the again, we see the large, darker old spots, and we see new spots as well, just a few of them. The Maria, one of the old spots, are shown dark in stipple, which is only the second time it was used for lunar engravings. And the craters are sort of very stylistically donut-shaped. They're circular, although they are foreshortened near the limb. So he observed that quite well. And since there's no twilight on the moon, things appear and disappear rather suddenly. And the idea was to see as the sunlight would hit a known feature, one should be able to time that and use that as a celestial clock, the same way one can use the satellites of Jupiter, for example. It never worked, but this really was the first map to attempt to precisely place lunar structures. But notice also that there are no mountains shown. There are only the flat areas, the mare, and craters. This whole area in here is just filled, it's chock-a-block with mountains, rills, valleys, hills. None of that is shown. At about this time also, Pierre Gassendi did a simplified map for the very same purpose of determining longitude, and I will not show that one, but this is a very, very interesting map. Just cartographically, there are only 4 known exemplars, 4 known copies of this map in existence. Now I show de Ruyter's map largely because it's the only moon map that mimics the appearance of terrestrial maps. It's the only moon map with a cartouche. And it's got a banner in the sky, you know, a curious banner in the sky, Excelsior. But it's the only one with a cartouche. The map itself is unremarkable. The craters are shown as little circles. He reverts to the Bari style shown in the woodblocks. We also have to remember, though, that these images were made for an audience that is very different than the terrestrial cartography. There were no publishers of moon maps the way the Blaus had a publishing house to do terrestrial atlases. They were circulated, the images were circulated among natural philosophers, and there was no great public audience. They were never issued originally colored. So any colored moon map you see from this period has been colored later, and many maps from Kircher's Mundus Subterraneus, for example, have later color. They were never issued colored. And the simplistic presentation of craters just really is meant to demonstrate the fact that these structures exist, and they're not meant to represent any specific crater. And these three things, I've got absolutely no idea what these three things are, but they look kind of nice. But we come to Hevelius, who's a giant of mid-17th century selenography, lunar cartography, publishing his Selenographia. And the maps seem to have ignored Milan's realism and the naturalism of Galileo, and we'll see that this is also built up of parallel engraved lines. Hevelius did 4 large maps. 3 of them, P, Q, and R, were used as illustrations for several hundred years. They're very famous maps. Each one has putti in the corner. The putti up the top are holding banners, and the ones down at the bottom have rich iconography. Hevelius was in a fairly acrimonious correspondence with others regarding the use of telescopic sights in determining star positions, and his putti represent this argument. So there's a lot of information contained in them. We see the ray system, and we see the lunar surface pockmarked with craters, and we see that he has chosen to use the parallel line engraved system to build up his images. His craters are sort of the donut craters. There's foreshortening near the limb. He recognizes the ray system as being light, and really it's not throwing a shadow the way we see on the inside of the craters. And the 3 maps, P, Q, and R, these are the large ones, I looked at every single crater that Hevelius engraved, and then there are thousands of them. There are only 2 that show a central peak. This one, Theophilus, and another central peak, sort of grudgingly shown in the crater Copernicus. But what's absent here, as it is in other maps, are the mountains. All we see are the Maria, the dark spots, the seas, and the highly idealized, the highly stylized caricatures of craters. But Hevelius's map Q, everything is mountainous. And these are the typical kinds of sugarloaf or molehills that we see on late 16th century, early 17th century terrestrial maps. But everything is shown as being composed of mountains, including, oddly enough, the ray system. Now, the rays have no thickness. They don't cast a shadow. And Hevelius knew that. He showed it on his other maps. On this map, he felt compelled to demonstrate them as chains of mountains. And I think what this does is it demonstrates the difficulty that people had in reconciling what they saw in the telescope with what they knew to be on the Earth. And never saw rays on the Earth, so somehow or other they were described selenographically as mountains. Now let me go back to this map. We notice that Hevelius shows two hemispheres overlapping. The moon doesn't show just its single face to us. It rocks back and forth and sideways. It wobbles in orbit. So we actually see 60% of the lunar surface, not just 50%, but we get peaks around the edges as it wobbles. And Hevelius shows that here. He shows the extremes of this wobbling, which is called libration. Now, libration is fine if you're just looking at the moon. It doesn't cause any problems, but it causes fits if you're trying to determine the distance of a feature from the lunar limb. Here, for example, this is known today as Mare Crisium. It can get as close to the lunar limb as it's shown here, or as far away as is shown here. So this makes mapping the moon quantitatively very, very difficult. And you'll see that in the 17th century, there aren't any latitude and longitude marks on any of these maps. And this is just remarkable. This is the only map in Hevelius's Selenographia that he himself did not engrave. He did all of the other engravings himself. He also engraved some 20-odd lunar phases. And in depicting those, he used a completely different visual language. He did not build up his images by means of parallel lines of different thicknesses, but he actually drew them. And there are very few shadows visible here. This is really, a planimetric map. And it's difficult, the Maria cross-hatched, and it's difficult to understand what he meant by these varying lighter strips of parallel lines. He showed this is actually the dark side. This is the unilluminated side. He showed that light in his phase images. Now, Hevelius's large hemispheric moon maps were used for several hundred years as illustrations in textbooks and were widely disseminated and widely discussed. His 20-some-odd phase diagrams never appeared in any subsequent astronomy or lunar books. They sort of disappeared, and partly because his switch of language made it very difficult to understand what he was trying to show here. They've sort of gone into oblivion, and what I've done is I've taken high-resolution images of all of his phase maps, and they're available to download from mappingthemoon.org, all of Hevelius's phases. They're kind of interesting to look at. They're difficult to interpret. Art historians have a field day with them, though. They love them. This is one of the great, wonderful maps. It's entirely etched. Ewan Whitaker, in his 1999 book, which is just a classic, Mapping and Naming of the Moon, illustrated it but he had little positive to say about it. And that's because very little was known. It disappeared. It was drawn in 1660 by Montanari, who's best known. He was a very well-known astronomer. He was best known for determining the period of the variable star Algol. And he's very well known in his day. But this map was appended to an ephemeris that was really an ephemeral ephemeris and disappeared. Nobody kept ephemeridae. We can't pronounce it. Nobody kept ephemerises, and it disappeared. And it was not rediscovered until the 1920s. The problem is that Carlo Bonaccini, who discovered the map in the 1920s, wrote it up in an equally obscure publication that also disappeared. It was a publication of an observatory. That publication evidently was not kept. It's very hard to find that publication. I fortunately found a copy of it, got a copy of it from an Italian antiquarian book dealer. And that too is up on mappingthemoon.org if anyone's interested in it. But if we look at the visual language of this map, suddenly it's not pictorial. It's not a pictographic map. It's Montanari recognized crater pleomorphism. These are quite accurately drawn. He recognized the presence of central peaks. And he delineated outlines very clearly. He used lines. He didn't imply anything. There was no insinuating structure. It was delineating it specifically. And he did this by observing the moon over an entire lunation and drawing the terminator as he could see the detail under oblique sunlight, and assembled this this fairly large map. It's quite impressive. And I have a very strong feeling that if it hadn't disappeared, that it really would have had a huge impact on the way lunar topography was depicted over the next 200 years. This type of representation was not used again until 1910 by Walter Goodacre. If you look at it closely, though, it's very curious because we see outlines, but we can't tell whether something is a hill or a depression. We know these things to be depressions, so our eye tells us this. But there's no way of determining it from the language used on the map, even though these are sort of form lines. There's no vertical bottom on the moon. There is no sea level. So form lines are relative to the adjacent terrain. And if we try to use shadows to determine whether something is a hill or a depression, we run into a problem. Here, for example, if this is a crater, the light would have to be coming from this direction in order for there to be a shadow here. But basically, in the same field, we have a shadow here, which means the light had to be coming from here. And over here, the light has to be coming from here. Montanari did not mean these to be shadows. He almost anticipated hachures. They were meant to depict slopes, because the sunlight they're not shadows because the sunlight's coming from all kinds of different directions, so they can't be shadows. But this is an extremely interesting map, and unfortunately, it disappeared until the 1920s. Now, my hero, Robert Hooke, great microscopist, also drew the moon. He had one lunar drawing, this is it. And he employed the Milan technique of horizontal lines to imply structure. For some reason, he decided to use that visual language on the moon when all of his other work, drawing what he saw in the microscope, was very realistic. This is the left eye of a fly. He didn't use parallel lines to build up the image. He didn't use Milan's technique to draw the eye of a fly. He drew what he saw. And if you looked at the fly now, with a modern instrument, you would see exactly what Hooke drew. But yet, for some reason, there was a persistence of the Milan style of parallel lines. Hevelius used it, and now Hooke used it, and the great Cassini used it. This is a remarkable map. It's a copper plate engraving. It's large, it's 63 centimeters in diameter. And again, this is not something one can see. If one looks at a full moon, it looks like the one that Milan drew. You don't see detail, you don't see dimensionality, but this was constructed from many choreographic drawings done by Cassini that are still present in the Paris Observatory. But let's look at this region here, and then at the very tip of this white arrow. We look here first. We see at some larger magnification, one of the big problems of using the parallel line technique to insinuate structure. These are what are called today the Lunar Alps, the Alpine region. We can tell they're mountains, but that's all we can tell. There's no finer detail visible. This is the ringed plain known as Plato. This crater is now today known as Cassini. All of these structures are real. They're not imaginary, but we can't get more detail out of this. Just parenthetically, there's a giant valley here called the Alpine Valley that Cassini missed, and it was discovered 30 some odd years later. But however attractive this is, when you look at it at a distance, when you look up close, it loses information. This visual language is very good if you're drawing portraits of people, horses, dogs, but it's not really good for cartographic purposes. Montanari's visual language was much better. We can enlarge that, and we don't lose information. But Cassini, at the tip of that white arrow, also introduced a profile of his wife. And this is a famous moon maiden. The craters are sort of the characteristic donuts without much specific detail. But what is important about depicting his wife is that there is a duality to this image. And there's a duality to Cassini's concept of what he's showing. Is it a picture or is it a map? There's he didn't transform the thing into a Leo Belgicus or a Europe as a woman, but there is this persistent ambiguity, if you will, as to whether or not what's being shown is a picture or is sort of a hard-nosed map. It's rather attractive, though. It's nice that he put it in. When we come to the last image of the century, Georg Eimert's etching. This is really done from images by his daughter, Maria Clara. So it's really the first moon map, if you will, done by a woman. And it's generally agreed that it's not meant to be an accurate depiction of the lunar surface, but rather it's an abstraction. And if we look at it more closely, clearly, this is not meant to be a diagram of this surface, but it's impressionistic. And so we have throughout the 17th century, we start with Galileo's artistic impression, and we end the story with Eimert's purely artistic impression, and varying degrees of artistic ability and languages, visual languages in between. And it's really difficult to transfer understanding of terrestrial cartography to lunar mapping. Lunar maps were made for a different audience, and the selenographers were either independently wealthy or well-positioned. There was not a map trade for them, nor was there a general market. But they began at a discrete time in history, and we can follow them from that time and see how the experiment went. There's a lot of rich detail, though, that I've not touched upon. For example, nomenclature and taxonomy, and there's a lot of interesting evolution of toponyms from Van Langren through Riccioli, and the attempt to use the map as a celestial timepiece. The instruments are fascinating. Telescopes were very, very difficult to use, and they still are. So we have to appreciate the fact that there's an extraordinary accomplishment to capture these images. These telescopes are hard to use. Take a pair of binoculars, let's say a 10x binoc, and try to look at the moon with it by holding it up. You've got to have a mounting for it. And that becomes very complex. It wasn't until 20 years ago that telescopes became relatively easy to use and didn't require this huge amount of tacit knowledge. Now, we end the story with a question. Are they maps or are they pictures? And if we look very carefully at the images, we see both. We see attempts at mapping and attempts at pictorial representation. And I end with this woodblock from Schädel's Liber Chronicarum of 1493. And he's sort of a pensive fellow, and I think that's a good way to end.
Thank you, Frank. From my perspective as a sort of a land lover, this was very informative and instructive. There are several questions in the chat. I think we should go to those. My first thought was, how widely available were telescopes? And I think you probably touched on this at the end. How much of what you're seeing in the maps was original observation or copies or hypothesis?
Everything on the maps that I've selected were original observations. These are not copies from previous maps. Interestingly enough, in selenography, every selenographer began with a blank hemisphere. I think I can click end of show. Well, I'm afraid to click anything else or everything will disappear. Every selenographer began with a blank slate and put his own observations in. There were no mother maps until the 19th century, when the Beer and Madler map was used as a basis for building additional information. Very little of it was fantasy. They were attempts to show what they saw. Now, availability of telescopes is another issue. Galileo actually perfected the telescope. It was known before Galileo, but he was also a master craftsman and was able to create lenses that gave him reasonable definition. Most of the images were made with telescopes ranging from 10 to about 30 magnification. The practical upper limit of magnification in the 17th century was about 40 times. So these aren't high magnification images. Telescopes were, good telescopes were very rare. They were exceedingly expensive. One of the Medicis wanted a telescope from Galileo, and he really kind of dragged his foot because they were very hard to make, they were very scarce, and he really didn't want to give one up, even to his patron. So there weren't very many, and there were fewer still people who were both good draftsmen and good observers. The amount of tacit knowledge needed to use one of these telescopes was pretty staggering.
Okay, here is a question from Angel Abud. Was it the first telescopic map of the moon a drawing made by Thomas Harriot, who observed the moon through a telescope 4 months before Galileo in August 1609?
Yes, it was not published though. Harriot's drawings, which are still in existence, were never published. His later drawings are probably based on Galileo's observations, but Galileo's were the first published disseminated images of the moon through a telescope. So the fact that Harriot looked at the moon and made drawings before Galileo is really interesting. On the other hand, they weren't known. I forgot when they were discovered, but they had no influence whatsoever on subsequent selenography.
Okay, 2 comments or questions from Nick Canas. Hevelius also included a full moon Bovell in his atlas for calculation purposes, comment, and then excellent talk. Could you comment on Riccioli's lunar map?
Yeah, Riccioli's lunar map is best known for the nomenclature that was used, which is basically the nomenclature used today. There were 2 competing nomenclatures at the time. The earliest one was pretty much discarded. So we had Hevelius's and we had Riccioli's. Hevelius gave names to lunar features based on terrestrial names. He thought it would be a lot easier for people to remember something on the moon if it had a name of something on the Earth. Riccioli had a different system of nomenclature. He named things after philosophers, scholars, natural philosophers, historical figures, and he had something like over 200 names. most of which are still in use. Maybe one or two of Hevelius's are in use today, but the two systems competed for about 100 years, and the competition was largely Catholic versus Lutheran. The Lutheran astronomers tended to stick with Hevelius's nomenclature for a while. The Southern European astronomers tended to stick with Riccioli's, and for a period of time, some selenographers used both. There are examples of maps in the margins that have both nomenclatures side by side. So the Riccioli map is really the first one to use modern names, or names that are used in modern times. And that, of course, it's a different issue than the visual languages, and it has to do with really, what do you call things? You know, they just as easily could have called the crater Clavius, they could have called it Fred. It really doesn't tell you anything about that structure. It wasn't until geology became somewhat more sophisticated and there began to be hypotheses about how these structures were formed, that you began to have a more rigorous taxonomy, the sort of thing that poor Fontana tried to do very early on.
Okay. Nick also raised a procedural question about how, where would this video of this presentation be available? The video will be made available in the members only section of the Washington Map Society website. If others of you are interested, we will share it with Frank, and you can get in touch with him. Question from Tim Weiskell. Your key question was, are these maps or are they pictures? He adds, actually, humanists would say they are both. They are not presentations, they are representation, that is representation. What do you think?
Yeah, they are representations, and part of their appearance, and I didn't touch on this at all, part of the appearance of these different images depends upon their mode of reproduction. Galileo, and I think it was in his haste to get his book out, chose to have his images etched, which can be done rather quickly. But etching, woodblock, and engraving are very different procedures, and they give different appearances to things. So part of what we see is process dependent. Part of what we see is how good a draftsman somebody was. And part of what we see is what was their intent. I mean, were they trying to be Constable and draw a pastoral scene? Or were they drawing from nature? And I think most of them were drawing from nature. The way people who did botanicals or anatomies of the time did. And Montanari is really the only one who tried to use a language that was less ambiguous. I mean, it's hard to argue that Montanari's map was anything but an attempt to depict this, to map the surface. It wasn't pictorial. So yeah, it has elements of of artistic representations. And yet, as I show in this last slide, for 400 years, people have been calling them maps. So I suppose we all know what's meant by that. It's only when we dig deep that we begin to question whether or not what we're looking at are drawings from nature or are they maps.
Okay, we're running sort of late. Let me do one more question. Thank you for an informative, this is from Roberta Stevens. How exciting it must have been to see the emergence of the moon's features. Did they understand what created the craters and the crater peaks?
One word answer, no. They had no idea what these craters were. There's nothing like that on Earth. So the tendency was to consider them volcanic. And volcanism was the mechanism that until World War II was generally considered to be the geological formative power that created craters. The central peak, and James Naismith, who was a great proponent of the volcanic process, considered them to be crater cones. The crater erupted, threw out the lava that formed the walls of the crater, and as the volcano died, it left its cone. Now, when you look very closely at the moon with a telescope, very few of these central peaks have pits at the top. They aren't crater cones. The slopes of all of the central peaks and of the sides of the craters are unlike volcanic crater cones, volcanic craters. They're more like the subsidence craters one sees in Hawaii, Hawaii Mau Mau, for example. But there was some indication around early in the 20th century that they were impact craters. And it wasn't until Baldwin, who was a physicist, I believe, and who worked with the military and did quantitative studies and calculated the energy of impacts, that it became clear that these are impact craters. And an impact crater will very often have a rebound, and the central peak is the rebound from the displacement of the thing that gets hit. The rays, of course, are ejecta from these impacts, and there's no atmosphere, so they travel hundreds and hundreds of miles. A lot of the craters have polygonal outlines, and that's very common in impact craters. We see that in Meteor Crater here in the United States. That's a polygonal crater. But Baldwin's quantitative work, I think, sealed the fate. And of course, it's pretty well ascertained that these are impact craters, that the Earth at one time had them, but they all got eroded. But at the time they were observed, there was absolutely no reference point. What do you call them? And when Schroeder called them crater, he did not mean to imply that they were volcanic craters. He used crater as a synonym for cup. In other words, a cup-like depression. But sometimes these words get acquired different usage. Schiaparelli, for example, used the term canali for the lines that he thought he saw on Mars. That got translated to canals, and then Percival Lowell ran with that one. So the term crater, as used by Schroeder in 1790s in his Selenotopographische Fragmente, did not mean to imply anything volcanic, but it came to mean that, and until well into the 20th century, volcanism was thought to be the cause of these structures. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer.
Okay, so for the people who may have other questions, would you mind giving them your email contact?
Yeah, it's let's see, the one that I generally look at is just office@fmanasek.com. That's one word, fmanasek.com.
Okay. So I'd like to thank you. We usually have some gifts for the speaker. Now these are more of an earthly cartographic representation. And one is a set of note cards of Washington, D.C., reflecting the fact that you spoke to us as the Washington Map Society. And then 2 cut line map images of the states of Vermont and New Hampshire.
Oh my.
I try to get the city you're from, but I'm sorry, this particular firm doesn't, what is it, Hanover?
Well, right now I'm in Hanover.
Okay.
We also live in Norwich, Vermont.
Okay, well, they just didn't have maps of those cities, so you'll have to be satisfied with the state. Okay, it is getting late, but I guess if we could open the room for maybe about 5 minutes of conversation.
Well, thank you very much. That's really splendid. I really look forward to that. The maps of Vermont and New Hampshire are particularly dear to our heart. We have very fond attachments to this area.
Well, thank you, Frank. That's